Hi everyone, Tony Tonkin here from the Child Protection Party. The conversation that I want to have with you today is about domestic violence, particularly its impact on those people that are single, that are escaping from domestic violence, and their children. Now, I want to be clear that I'm not going to get into a debate or discussion necessarily about who are the victims of domestic violence. And I know that, and I will acknowledge right at the outset that domestic violence happens right across the board, whether male, female, whether you're in an LGBTQIA plus community or whether you're from a different cultural background. I acknowledge that under all those circumstances, people receive behaviour from their partners that is inappropriate and harmful. There was a session on Q&A on the ABC last night that was illuminating, interesting, and raised some really serious issues about how we deal with domestic violence. If you wish to go on to YouTube, I'll put down in the comment section the YouTube video in relation to that particular segment of Q&A. But I think it's important to remember a number of things. And I want to tie this into child protection in particular in a moment. But when a person leaves, and I'll talk primarily about women in these cases, and not just women, so I don't want guys to have a go at me about it being about men as well. I know it's about men as well. But particularly when a woman leaves a violent situation, no matter who she is, no matter where she lives, she may find herself in a situation whereby there's very little money. She has left the primary caregiver, or the primary financial caregiver anyway, in that home, and is often on her own. Now, this creates enormous problems for women in particular, and is usually one of the reasons why women stay within DV relationships. Now, I've been working in this area for over 30 years. I've worked with men and women around domestic violence, and I think I have a pretty good understanding as to the reasons why people remain in those situations. One of the most interesting reasons, I think, is that women feel trapped within a situation whereby the financial provider is their partner, and having to leave provides a whole host of unknown questions for them. Number one, are they going are they able to find appropriate work for them, which is not just about caring for them, not just about providing housing, but it's also about looking after their children that leave with them. This means, though, that many women will choose to remain within those relationships. If you've had any of those experiences, I'd like you to let us know. I'd like you to have a conversation with us about what has kept you within relationships that are violent and abusive, and the impact that this has on children. On the Q&A, there's this wonderful man who I can't quite remember his name. However, people will recognise him. So he was a guy whose mother was killed in South Australia. She was stabbed by his father while at a function at the festival centre, I think it was. And as a result of that, he had to be confronted with the fact that his father was not only killed his mother, but that he'd been living in a violent household for some 20 years. The interesting thing for me was that he was able to identify that there were behaviours that he had learnt from his father, which had impacted relationships as he was growing up. My experience working with men is that on many occasions they were in families where violence, for whatever reason, seemed to be acceptable, that they witnessed abuse, coercive control over their mothers, and saw that as the natural progression of things. So he was able to acknowledge that he had a number of relationships whereby he could see that the damage that he was doing to those relationships was irreversible. He lost those relationships, and then he realised that his behaviour was similar to that of his father, and he acknowledged that had he continued with those behaviours, he would eventually kill one of his partners as well. Now, the reason why I raise this is that it's important to understand that children learn those behaviours by watching their parents' behaviours. And if they see, particularly males, if they see their male role model, namely their father, behaving in ways that are unhelpful, inappropriate, and particularly harmful to others, and they will see the effects and the impacts that has on the victim of those behaviours, they might then think that that behaviour is okay, because that way the father, in this case their role model, gets what it is that he should have got from being coercive. And therefore they enact those behaviours later on. I see that in many cases that I work with where young kids have been in those sort of relationships, and where the mother, in all of the cases that I've worked with, has left. And those children who have also been taken into care wind up exhibiting the same sort of behaviours as they experienced by their father while their mother remained in that violent and abusive relationship. I think we need to acknowledge a number of things. That is, the impact that behaviours have on children, and the fact that many of those behaviours are plainly unhelpful, particularly disrespectful behaviours. In the same way, we need to acknowledge, in fact, that if drug use is dominant within a household, then it is quite clear that eventually that will be seen as normal behaviour, and children will take that on as they move into adulthood. As they see disruptive behaviours towards, or harmful behaviours towards partners, they'll think that is the norm, and they'll also carry that on into adulthood. I think this is of major concern to all of us. I think that we need to find ways to address some of these issues. Now, one of the things that I think is really important is that when a person, male or female, is escaping from a violent and abusive relationship and are financially disadvantaged when they leave that relationship, then they should receive some financial support until they're able to find their feet and bring in the income that is required for not only themselves but also for their children. And that should be a substantial amount of money, not just $400 or $500 a week, which is currently proposed, but also, maybe $1,000, $1,500 a week, until such time as these people can be established if they're leaving those relationships. Also, it's important to understand that, and this is vital, that when people choose to leave a relationship, that is when they're the most vulnerable. That is the time at which they are most likely to be harmed. Recently, and I mean in the last few weeks, I've had a case where a woman, at the point that she was choosing to leave, her partner threatened to kill her. And as a result of that, I had to call the police. But the point is that it was at that point that she was leaving that the partner chose to find a way, or threatened her with potential death. This is a time that we need to be really mindful and supportive of those that are leaving violent and abusive relationships. The other point I want to make is that these relationships are often are not just in, and there's some research that has been done that confirms this, that they're not just in those low socioeconomic places, that they're not just in the poorer areas of town. They are everywhere. That people are violent and abusive regardless of their financial situation. They're violent and abusive regardless of the suburb in which they live. That there are many people who are suffering from violent and abusive relationships who live in wealthy areas. And to some extent, if those particular people trying to escape from those relationships find it more difficult, because they've gone from what is a very healthy income to virtually no income at all. The desire to have to stay, or the need, or the perceived need to have to stay within those relationships because of the income provided is extreme, as one can imagine. Also, the other reason for why a lot of people stay within those relationships, particularly in wealthier areas or those people that are wealthier, is that they want to stay there because they believe it's important for their kids to have a father and to be able to go to a private school and get the best that they can out of life that the father usually can provide because they are providing the bulk of the income. The final thing I want to raise too is the impact that this has on the police's interaction to domestic violence. Now, on a case that I was just cited earlier that I had these particular people lived in a wealthy area, and the police interaction to them was fabulous. I can't criticise them at all. It supported the woman in this case, and they came back with further information. They put out an AVO. They did all the right things, and it was fantastic to see that happen. My issue, though, is that if that happened in a low socioeconomic area, would it have been as significant? Would the police have responded in the way that they did if it was someone who was in poverty, if there were drug and alcohol being used, and particularly if they were Indigenous? So in a wealthy area, the response is fantastic. In a poor area, I would suspect that the judgments come into play and that police would not be responding in perhaps the same way. If anybody's had any experiences around any of that, we here at CPP would certainly like to know. Finally, when it comes to working with the department, when someone's escaping from a domestic violence relationship, often our experience is that the department tends to blame women for having been in that relationship in the first place, which means they don't understand relationships and they particularly don't understand what domestic violence is either. And then, to make it even worse, the department uses, and I have spoken about this before, but the department uses coercive control in order to encourage people to do what it is that the department wants them to do. What they fail to understand often is that the coercive control they're using represents the same sort of control that was delivered to them by the perpetrator of the violence. And so the two are the same. And then they're placing women who are distraught enough generally because they've had their children removed, they're behaving in the same way as their ex-partner had by coercing them to do behaviours that perhaps they don't think are all that necessary. So they've gone from one situation where they've been coerced and abused into another situation where their children have been removed, which is traumatic enough, to also a situation where they believe they are being coerced. So there's something we need to do about better understanding those people that have come out of violent relationships and how it is that we can find more appropriate ways to work with them so they don't feel that they're representing the same environment as they've just left. And then, women who are escaping from domestic violence in particular, they want to feel safe. They want to feel secure. They want to know that their children are safe and secure. The last thing that they need to have inflicted upon them is blame for having been in a violent relationship, for having not left it sooner than what they should have, and we cannot sit down and blame people for simply staying in a relationship because we need to understand why it is that they did in the first place. And those people that understand domestic violence get that. But it appears to me that often within the department, they don't. So we need to do something about changing our whole mindset around domestic violence. And I've said finally before, I've just got one more thought. In this Q&A session on the ABC last night, the applause came when a young man made a statement about us men taking responsibility for what it is that we do primarily. that causes the violence in the first place. And to me, that's the key issue. As I said, I've been working with men for 30 years about this issue, and I've been encouraging men to take responsibility for their behaviour, because there's nothing about their behaviour that is positive, and it brings about such negative outcomes, not just for their partner and the children, but also for themselves. And if something doesn't work, then clearly you need to find ways to change it. And we need to make a stand wherever we see, us men need to make a stand wherever we see domestic violence occurring. We need to tell other men that that behaviour is wrong and it needs to stop. We need to make a stand for us as men, because this is not who we are. This is not how we wish to be represented. This is not how I wish to be represented. So we need to make that stand immediately when we see any violence, any coercive control, any emotional or psychological or financial or physical abuse. We need to make a stand against it and tell that person that it is wrong. And we need to embrace those people that have experienced that as victims and encourage them to understand that this is not about them. It is not their fault. Children often will think that they're the ones that are responsible for a family breaking up, not because of the violence or anything else that's happening in the home, but they've done something wrong. Women will often say, and have said to me before, they feel responsible. They feel ashamed because they've stayed in a relationship for as long as they have, for they allowing it to happen. That shame and that guilt that all of those people feel is understandable, but it's not helpful. And we need to embrace those people and let them know that they're not responsible for whatever it is that has happened to them. Watch the Q&A session. Now, if you're watching this on YouTube, then I would ask you to subscribe and ring the bell to CPP so we can boost our numbers up. We'd really appreciate that. And so that you can be notified in the future when there are further postings from us. In the meantime, take care of each other. Make sure that there is no violence or abuse in your household. And if you are endeavouring to escape from domestic violence, find a domestic violence service that you can go to that can give you the support, even if you feel that you can't leave at this particular point in time. And there are things that need to be done. We need to change the structure of the family court and other courts so that those people escaping domestic violence can be heard, so that those people with money can't use that system in order to manipulate and to further coerce victims into doing what it is that they want. We need to make change. CPP, we're here to help you make those changes. You can help us by subscribing to CPP, to donating to us, to joining us, because our fight is your fight. Take care, everybody. Look after yourselves and be safe.